Have you ever wondered why some people lose their independence long before they lose their strength? I have asked myself that question more times than I can count. Today, at 105 years old, I still wake up in my own little house, make my own breakfast, water the flowers by my kitchen window, and lock my own front door before taking a slow walk to my mailbox. My children tell me I should let someone help. But I always smile and tell them that every small thing I can still do with my own hands feels like another beautiful gift. And yet, there was a time when I was almost certain this life would never be mine. If you stay with me until the end of my story, I want to share the quiet lessons that changed the direction of my life. They are not miracles, and they are not secret cures. They are simply things I learned through many years of living, watching, making mistakes, and beginning again. 25 years ago, when I was 80, my doctor gently told me that my blood sugar had climbed too high. We spoke about type 2 diabetes and the possibility that my treatment might need to become stronger. I remember walking home with those words echoing in my heart. But what frightened me most was not the number on a laboratory report. It was the memory of my older sister. She had been a strong woman who raised her family with love, worked hard every day, and never complained. Little by little, diabetes took away the things she treasured most. First came the numbness in her feet. Then walking became difficult. Later, reading became harder because of her eyesight. In her final years, she no longer lived in the home she loved. She spent her days in a nursing facility, waiting for someone to help her with the smallest tasks. Every Sunday I visited her, and every Sunday I drove home with tears quietly filling my eyes. I kept asking myself the same question. Was that the only future waiting for me, too? That question stayed with me for months. It became impossible to ignore. I realized I could not change my age, but perhaps I could still change some of the habits that shaped each ordinary day. I did not know where that path would lead. I only knew that I wanted to remain part of my own life for as long as God allowed me. The first lesson that truly opened my eyes came from an explanation so simple that even now, after all these years, I still remember every word. Once you hear it, you may never think about blood sugar in quite the same way again. The doctor did not begin with complicated words or frightening charts. Instead, he picked up a blank sheet of paper, smiled at me, and drew a little church. Then he said, "Barbara, imagine Sunday morning. The aisle is full of people trying to find their seats. The people are the sugar from your food, and the usher is insulin. His job is simple. He helps everyone leave the aisle and sit where they belong." I laughed because it sounded more like a story than a medical appointment. But then he drew the pews closer together and said, "Now imagine that after years of crowded mornings, the people already sitting in the pews stop making room. The usher keeps asking them to slide over, but they barely move. More and more people remain standing in the aisle until everything becomes crowded." He looked at me kindly and said, "That crowded aisle is your blood sugar." I carried that picture home with me, and somehow it stayed in my mind far better than any medical term ever could. During the following weeks, I began paying attention to something I had never noticed before. Whenever I visited neighbors, traveled to see family, or met older people from different places, I quietly watched how they lived. Some of the healthiest men and women in their 80s and 90s were not following complicated diets. They simply ate slowly, cooked simple meals, and rarely rushed through life. Years earlier, during a visit to a small village overseas, I met an elderly couple who fascinated me. They worked in their garden every morning, laughed often, and treated every meal almost like a family celebration. Their table was never covered with expensive foods. There were eggs, vegetables, beans, herbs, fish whenever they could afford it, and fruit in season. At the time, I admired them without understanding why they seemed so full of life. Now their faces kept returning to my memory. I started wondering if perhaps the answer had never been hidden in some rare supplement or costly product. Maybe it had always been waiting inside ordinary foods prepared with patience and eaten with gratitude. My doctor gave me one simple challenge. He told me not to think about starving my body or fearing every bite. Instead, he suggested looking at food as a helper with three quiet jobs. First, to let sugar enter the bloodstream more gently, instead of all at once. Second, to help calm the body's constant irritation that can build over many years. Third, to support the body so it could respond to insulin more easily. Those three ideas became my little guide every time I stepped into my kitchen. I did not change everything overnight. I simply began with breakfast. Looking back now, I believe that one small morning decision opened the door to every other change that followed. And what replaced the breakfast I had eaten for more than 50 years surprised even me. For more than 50 years, my mornings looked exactly the same. I believed I was making the healthiest choices possible because that was what everyone around me believed too. I poured a bowl of cereal, toasted 2 slices of bread, spread a little jam if I felt cheerful, and finished everything with a large glass of orange juice. It looked colorful. It felt comforting. But by the middle of the morning, I was already hungry again. Some days my hands felt a little shaky. Other days I found myself opening the cookie tin before lunch without even thinking about it. I blamed my age. I blamed the weather. I blamed poor sleep. It never crossed my mind that breakfast itself might be quietly setting the tone for the rest of my day. When my doctor suggested trying something different, I was skeptical. Eggs instead of cereal? Half an avocado instead of toast? It sounded strange to a woman who had spent decades believing fat was something to fear. Still, I remembered my promise to myself after visiting my sister. If I wanted a different future, I would have to be willing to build different mornings. So I gave it a chance. The first week felt unusual. The second week felt easier. By the third week, I noticed something that surprised me far more than any number on my glucose meter. I was no longer thinking about food every hour. My mornings felt calmer, almost quieter, as though my body had stopped shouting at me. That simple breakfast did not erase my diabetes, and I never expected it to. But it became the first small step that made every other healthy choice feel less like a struggle. Later, I met an elderly woman at a local farmer's market who laughed when I told her about my new breakfast. She was 93 and still carried baskets heavier than I could manage. She said, "When you begin your day peacefully, your body often spends the rest of the day trying to keep that peace." I have never forgotten those words. Over the years, I noticed something similar in many people who stayed active well into old age. They did not constantly chase the newest miracle food. They built simple routines and repeated them with patience. That was when I began paying attention to foods that slowed everything down in the gentlest possible way. One of the first surprises came from tiny seeds that most shoppers walked past without a second glance. They looked ordinary, almost forgettable. Yet the story behind them made me realize that sometimes the smallest things in nature quietly carry the biggest lessons. One afternoon, I stood in the grocery store staring at a shelf full of spices, wondering how something so small could possibly matter. An elderly gentleman beside me smiled when he saw me turning little jars over in my hands. He said, "Most people spend their lives searching for expensive answers while walking right past simple ones." At the time, I thought he was only making conversation. Years later, I still remember his words every time I open my spice cabinet. My doctor had suggested I look at a few ordinary foods that might help meals move through my body more gently. Not because they were magic, and certainly not because they could replace my medicine, but because small choices, repeated day after day, sometimes add up in ways we do not notice at first. One of the first things I tried was fenugreek seeds. I had never even heard of them before. They were inexpensive, tucked away on a shelf where very few people seemed to stop. I soaked a small amount overnight as I had been shown. I will be honest with you, they were not my favorite taste. They were slightly bitter, and I almost gave up after the first few mornings. But something inside me reminded me that the best habits are not always the easiest ones. I started slowly, giving myself time to adjust, and before long they simply became another quiet part of my routine. Around that same time, I discovered chia seeds. Those tiny little seeds amazed me because they changed completely after sitting in water. They reminded me of dry soil after the first spring rain. Instead of rushing everything along, they seemed to slow the meal in the gentlest possible way. I stirred them into plain yogurt or let them soften with a little water and lemon. It became less about following instructions and more about creating a breakfast that left me feeling steady instead of searching for another snack an hour later. Then came another surprise that challenged everything I thought I knew. Lentils. For years, I believed that every food containing carbohydrates belonged on the list of things to fear. Yet here was my doctor encouraging me to enjoy a modest serving of lentil soup instead of refined starches. He explained it in such simple words that I never forgot them. Not all foods arrive in your body at the same speed. Some seem to rush through the front door all at once, while others enter quietly, giving your body more time to keep up. That idea changed the way I looked at my dinner table forever. Still, my progress eventually slowed, and I began wondering whether I had reached the end of what food alone could do. That was when I learned that the next lesson was hiding in two everyday kitchen staples that many people already have at home, yet few ever use with real purpose. And that discovery surprised me even more than the seeds ever had. The next change in my kitchen did not come from an expensive health store or a colorful advertisement. It came from two humble items that had been sitting on grocery shelves for years while I walked right past them. The first was Ceylon cinnamon. I had sprinkled cinnamon on desserts all my life without giving it much thought, but one afternoon my doctor explained that not all cinnamon is the same. He suggested using a small amount of Ceylon cinnamon with meals that contained healthy carbohydrates, never expecting miracles, only looking for another gentle way to support the healthy habits we were building together. I stirred a little into my morning oatmeal when I occasionally enjoyed it, or into plain yogurt with a handful of berries. It became less about the spice itself and more about creating meals that felt balanced instead of rushed. Around the same time, I learned another simple habit that seemed almost too ordinary to matter. Before my largest meal of the day, I mixed a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar into a full glass of water and drank it slowly. My doctor reminded me never to drink it straight because it could be harsh on my teeth and throat. He also reminded me of something even more important. If I was taking medication for my blood sugar, every change I made in my diet should be discussed with him, because healthy foods and prescribed treatment work together, not against one another. I never forgot that advice. Every improvement we made happened side by side, with regular checkups and careful conversations. Looking back, I believe that partnership gave me confidence instead of fear. As the months passed, I noticed another pattern that fascinated me. The older people who remained active well into their 90s often shared one habit that had nothing to do with counting calories. They rarely skipped real meals, and they almost never relied on heavily processed foods. One fisherman I met during a family trip told me he had eaten fish several times a week since he was a boy. He laughed and said the sea had fed his family long before anyone invented fancy diets. His wife kept a small bowl of walnuts on the kitchen table instead of cookies. She would offer them to every visitor with a warm smile, saying they kept everyone satisfied until supper. Their home felt peaceful, and so did the way they ate. Another memory still makes me smile. A neighbor invited me to taste tiny broccoli sprouts she had grown on her windowsill. They looked so delicate that I wondered why anyone would bother with them. She told me they were one of her favorite additions to salads and sandwiches because they added freshness to every meal. I began growing a few myself, and every time I watched those little green shoots appear, I was reminded that strong things often begin quietly. Yet after all those years, I came to a surprising conclusion. The food on my plate explained only part of my story. The greatest lesson, the one I wish someone had shared with my sister long before her health began to fade, had almost nothing to do with the kitchen at all. When people ask me what finally made the biggest difference, they often expect me to name one special food. I always smile because life has taught me that health is rarely built on one thing alone. It grows from many small choices that quietly support one another, just as the beams of an old house work together to keep the roof standing. If even one beam is ignored for too long, the whole house begins to feel weaker. That is how I started looking at my own life after my 80th birthday. Every morning became another opportunity to care for the house I had been given. I no longer hurried through breakfast. I chose simple foods that left me feeling satisfied instead of searching the pantry an hour later. I filled half my plate with colorful vegetables whenever I could. A bowl of lentil soup, a piece of baked fish, a handful of walnuts, eggs with avocado, or a fresh salad topped with broccoli sprouts slowly became familiar friends instead of unusual experiments. I found that preparing these meals with my own hands gave me a sense of purpose that no packaged food ever could. Even setting the table for one reminded me that I was still worth caring for. I also learned to pay attention to how my body responded instead of expecting overnight changes. Some weeks felt encouraging, while others seemed almost unchanged. That no longer discouraged me because I had stopped chasing quick results. My doctor and I looked at the bigger picture together during each visit. We celebrated small improvements, discussed my blood sugar readings, and adjusted my treatment only when he believed it was appropriate. I never stopped taking my medication on my own, and I never viewed healthy eating as a replacement for medical care. To me, they became partners walking side by side toward the same destination. Yet, if I am completely honest with you, everything I have shared about food explains only part of why I am still living independently today. Looking back over more than a century of life, I would say that perhaps 30% of my journey happened in the kitchen. The rest happened inside my heart. I noticed that the people who seemed to age with the greatest peace were not necessarily the ones with the most perfect diets. They carried less bitterness. They laughed more easily. They forgave sooner. They accepted that worry could steal tomorrow long before illness ever had the chance. Every evening before going to bed, I began letting go of whatever had troubled me during the day. Some nights I prayed. Other nights I simply sat quietly by the window, grateful for another sunset. That simple habit brought me a kind of calm that no recipe could provide. And over the years, I came to believe that a peaceful heart often makes it much easier to keep every other healthy habit alive. In the end, that quiet lesson became the strongest foundation beneath everything else I had learned, and it is the lesson I want to leave with you before my story comes full circle. Now you know why I still wake up every morning in the same little house that has sheltered so many seasons of my life. It is not because I escaped growing older. Believe me, I have felt every one of my 105 years. My hands are not as steady as they once were. I walk more slowly than I did at 60, and I rest more often than I care to admit. Age has visited me, just as it visits every one of us, but it never managed to take away the one thing I protected with all my heart, my independence. Looking back, I no longer see my journey as a battle against diabetes. I see it as a daily decision to care for myself with patience instead of fear. Every breakfast I prepared with love, every peaceful walk through my garden, every conversation filled with kindness, every moment I chose gratitude over worry became another small thread woven into the life I enjoy today. None of those choices were spectacular on their own, yet together they created something stronger than I ever imagined. If there is one lesson I hope you carry with you after listening to my story, it is this: it is never too late to make one gentle change. You do not have to change everything by tomorrow morning. You do not have to become perfect. Life has never asked perfection from any of us. It simply asks us to keep showing up, one day at a time. Perhaps today you choose a more satisfying breakfast. Tomorrow you take a short walk after dinner. The day after that, you call an old friend, forgive someone who has lived too long in your thoughts, or spend a few quiet minutes thanking life for another sunrise. These small moments may seem ordinary, but ordinary moments have shaped every extraordinary life I have ever known. Even now, when I stand at my kitchen window watching birds gather in the early morning light, I sometimes think about my sister. I wish she had known that caring for the heart and the mind could be just as important as caring for the dinner plate. I cannot change her story, but perhaps by sharing mine, I can encourage someone else to begin writing a different chapter today. And if you are living with type 2 diabetes, please remember that every change to your eating habits or treatment plan should be discussed with your healthcare professional. The foods and routines I have shared are simply part of my personal journey and should complement, not replace, the care your medical team provides. Before we say goodbye, I would love to know something about you. Please tell me your age and the country you are watching from. I read those messages with great joy because they remind me how many lives, families, and stories are connected through this little corner of the world. If one idea from my story spoke to your heart, come back in a few weeks and tell me how you are doing. And if you would like to hear more gentle lessons about healthy aging, simple food, and finding hope in the everyday moments of life, I would be honored if you subscribe to the channel. We are never too old to keep learning, and we are never too old to encourage one another.